A few weeks ago, after the Carolina Panthers made the decision to bench Bryce Young in favor of Andy Dalton, when Dave Canales was asked about the possibility at the time of trading Bryce Young, he said that we weren't going to entertain any trade talks for Bryce Young. Well, fast forward a few weeks later to now, recently Dave Canales was once again asked the question, are the Panthers going to trade Bryce Young? But instead of giving the answer and giving the definitive no, Dave Canales was kind of avoiding the answer to that question. He didn't really want to comment on it. So it looks like we could see Bryce Young on the move. And many folks out there are hoping that with Bryce Young getting traded to a new team, that he will have an opportunity to sit behind the vet, develop, and then potentially take over as the future starter. But to be honest with you guys, no matter where Bryce Young gets traded, if he gets traded at all, this dude is probably never going to be anything more but a career backup at best. And I know it's harsh, but the truth is that we've seen enough of Bryce Young to know that this dude is never going to have the ability to be as good as what CJ Stroud is. He's never going to be an elite quarterback. At best, he's a smaller but more mobile version of Tua Tagovailoa. And I seen this same scenario play out with Kenny Pickett down there in Pittsburgh. He also was a guy that people thought with him getting traded, he would have the opportunity to compete for a starting job. And now he's the backup to Jalen Hurts down there in Philly. And I can see the same situation playing out with Bryce Young. Even though people are going to want to work with Bryce Young to see if they can fix him up and help him reach his potential, I don't think that's going to happen, because no matter where Bryce Young goes, he's not going to go to a situation where he's going to be guaranteed the starting job. So therefore, he's going to have to work hard. He's going to have to perform well in practice and entice a team enough to give him the opportunity to not only compete for the starting job, but to actually name him the starter. And I don't really see any teams right now where you could say Bryce Young will be a definitive upgrade from what they have right now and what they could get in the draft. The Raiders, they don't need to trade for Bryce Young. They have no problem tanking this season and getting Shedeur Sanders in next year's draft. And with Tom Brady taking over as a minority owner, he is going to have a little bit of say of what goes on with that franchise. And I don't think there's any way the Raiders would trade for Bryce Young when your prized possession should be getting that first pick in next year's draft so you can draft Shedeur Sanders. And right now, if I was to ask you, who would you rather have, Shedeur Sanders or Bryce Young? We all know what the answer is. Shedeur Sanders. He has more potential, more upside than Bryce Young. I think you would be stupid if you're the Raiders to mortgage your future on drafting Bryce when you could have the opportunity to get a better quarterback in Shedeur Sanders. Now, with the Rams, that's an interesting situation because it looks like they want to move on from Matthew Stafford. They've been trying to trade him since last offseason. He almost got traded to the Jets nearly. And Bryce Young going to one of the greatest offensive minds in the history of this game, Sean McVay, you would believe that he will have a great chance to take over, develop into a really good starter. But how do you know if Sean McVay wants to settle on a guy like Bryce Young that has such a limited upside? And even though the Panthers are a bad situation, just because he goes to a better situation, there is no guarantee that he's going to improve relative to how he played in Carolina. We've seen similar stories where we've seen quarterbacks where it didn't work out in their first destination. They go somewhere else and they still don't improve that much. Sometimes you just have to accept the fact that certain quarterbacks just aren't good at the NFL level. And Bryce Young, with him being undersized, struggling to throw in the middle of the field, I don't see him being a good trade for the Rams to make. Because if you're going to trade for a quarterback, you're trading for a guy who you know is guaranteed to be a starter for you. And there's no guarantee that Bryce Young is going to give them starting caliber quarterback play. Not every head coach wants a reclamation project. What you're trying to say is that Bryce Young can still be saved. No, you think Bryce Young can still be saved. There's no guarantee that this brother can play. Some of y'all want to be in denial that your situation is everything. But when you get drafted that high, you have to be able to overcome limitations. Nobody that is a top 5 pick at quarterback goes into a tailor-made situation where they just have everything. Like Joe Burrow took the Bengals to the Super Bowl in the second season, coming off a leg injury that ended his rookie season and playing behind the worst offensive line to ever make it to the Super Bowl since Roger Staubach did it in the 70s with the Cowboys. That is something that is unheard of. Just because the Bengals had a lot of great receivers around Joe Burrow still didn't mean he had a great situation, because his offensive line was absolutely terrible. He is one of the few quarterbacks in the history of the NFL to win a playoff game despite being sacked 10 times. That shows you that Joe Burrow was able to overcome limitations. Cam Newton was the heart and soul for the Carolina Panthers franchise for several years when they took him first overall in 2011, and they didn't always have a great situation around them. When you draft a quarterback top 5 in the draft, you have to be able to overcome not having a good situation. And Bryce Young is not the kind of quarterback that can do that. Which is why, if you're the Rams, why would you settle for Bryce when you could potentially do better? At best, Bryce Young is a smaller version of Tua. Does that give Sean McVay a good chance to win another Lombardi trophy? I don't think so. If you are the Rams and you're going to mail in this season, you might as well go all in, start Stetson Bennett or Jimmy Garoppolo, try to put yourself in position to land either Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward. Which Shedeur Sanders, Cam Ward, that's the question that you got to keep asking. If you're any team in a quarterback market right now, why would we trade Bryce and, try to gamble on a reclamation project when we can go ahead and draft our own guy who we know potentially could have a high ceiling? Maybe the Browns could trade for Bryce Young, because I doubt Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders will want to play for them. But the options for Bryce Young are fairly limited. If this guy was as good as what people thought he was coming out of Alabama, he would have showed more flashes with the Panthers. He only had one good game, and that was against the Green Bay Packers. And even though the Panthers were just a shit show his rookie season, you want to have a few games that you can lay your hat on and say, yeah, these are the games that we've seen what Bryce Young can do when he's at his best. And even Anthony Richardson has had more games where he has flashed his potential. That's why the Colts will be dumb to give up on him right now. But Bryce Young has given you not too much to really be optimistic about. And at this point, I think it's fair to say that for now, if a team is trading for Bryce Young, they're just doing it for depth. Allow him to be the backup. Maybe he potentially can compete for the starting job in the foreseeable future. But for right now, I don't really see any team trading for Bryce Young with the vision of him potentially being their franchise quarterback. If anybody trades for Bryce Young, they probably are going to give up a 5th or 6th round pick, and then they probably are going to view him as backup material. Because if you are a team right now where you know your quarterback position sucks, you're the Giants, you know you're probably going to have a high draft pick next year, it makes no sense to waste any draft capital when you know you're bad on Bryce Young, when you could potentially get a better quarterback in next year's draft. Now, let's say that you can't get Cam Ward, you can't get Shedeur Sanders, you're most likely going to be picking outside of the top 10, the top 15, then it makes more sense to go ahead and try to roll the dice on Bryce Young. Because here's another way you can approach this Bryce Young trade possibility, right? Let's say that you are a team that is the New York Jets, right? Most likely you're going to need a quarterback next year. You currently have Jordan Travis on the roster, but we don't really know if he's going to be NFL caliber. And yet he hasn't even played a single game, hasn't really gotten any snaps due to him recovering from that injury that ended his Florida State career and kept him out the playoffs. So if you're the Jets, you're probably going to be a 7-win team or better. You're probably going to be picking top 15 or later in the draft, which takes you out of position to get Cam Ward or Shedeur unless you make a massive trade up. And 9 times out of 10, if you can't get either of those two quarterbacks, you might as well go ahead and roll the dice on Bryce Young, because the way I view Bryce Young is this. The only two quarterbacks worth drafting in the 2025 draft are Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward. If you can't get any of those two guys, you probably shouldn't draft a quarterback in the first round next year, because Quinn Ewers isn't first round material. He's injury prone and he's inconsistent. You saw how he looked against Georgia. He got benched in replace of Archman, and yeah, he came back in that game, but Quinn Ewers has not lived up to the hype that he had coming out of high school. The dude was like the highest rated recruit in high school history. Jalen Milroe, we've more than seen that this dude is more closer to Malik Willis than he is Lamar Jackson. He just doesn't have the accuracy or the decision making needed to be a successful NFL quarterback. He could be a reclamation project, but at that point, with you not being able to get Shedeur or Cam Ward, you're asking yourself, would we rather try to invest the draft pick and rehabilitating Bryce Young potentially, or would we be better off rolling the dice with a Quinn Ewers, a Carson Beck, a Jalen Milroe? Do we view Bryce Young as a better prospect than those guys? If you're a team having that conversation, then it would probably make a little bit of sense to trade for Bryce Young. Maybe the Browns could do it, because if you can't get any of the top two QBs to want to come play for you, you probably would be better off running it with Bryce Young. And if he doesn't work out, then you'll put yourself in position to maybe draft the Arch Manning in next year's draft or the year following. So, I mean, just being honest with you guys, as much as I loved Bryce Young coming out of college, as much belief as I had in him that he was going to become a great NFL quarterback, when I watch these Panthers games and I see that the offense looks better than what it did with Andy Dalton in compared to Bryce, it doesn't give me a lot of hope that this dude is going to mature into the quarterback that we envisioned him becoming out of Alabama. And maybe it's just another one of those instances where you got a guy that was phenomenal in college, but he didn't quite make the transition to the NFL because he had limitations with his size. He just didn't have the skill set that translated well. I really just think that it's over for Bryce Young. I think for the rest of his career, he's going to be nothing but a journeyman backup. Maybe he'll be a low-end fringe starter, be a bridge quarterback. Maybe he'll have like a Sam Darnold, Geno Smith resurrection arc or redemption arc. But I don't really believe that Bryce Young is anything more than a career backup at this point in his career.